and welcome to the next edition of the Value Exchange podcast. I am Annabelle Lambert, and I am here with my usual co-host, Rob Pye. Say hello, Rob Pye.
Hi.
Every week. We have an awkward pause at that moment. It's our signature. Awkward pause. But I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Ben Goldsmith, who has recently authored a book called God is an Octopus, A Loss, Love and a Calling to Nature, which is out now. Ben first engaged with us around an event that Ethos was organising at Windsor Castle around nature and rewilding, organised by Ethos partner Jeff Cars. Jeff founded Ethos Ventures, Ethos Wilder and Wilder Sensing, and he lives in Somerset, and so does Ben. And I know that Jeff and Ben have also been involved in the Wilder Wedmore Eel Release Project, which was sponsored by Ben. Unfortunately, Ben wasn't able to make the Windsor event, but Jeff and Rob subsequently met Ben in London and had coffee, and we have stayed in touch ever since. And we are delighted to talk with Ben a bit more about his journey and his finding of his own meaning, and where we're going with that, and how that relates to how we might have a better world for people and planet. So Ben, tell us a bit about yourself, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm such a fan of Ethos, and I was sorry not to be at that extraordinary event in Windsor. So many people that I admire and value a lot were there, and I think the output from those discussions continues to be felt in our national conversation. The whole nature restoration movement in this country is becoming really exciting. Some big kind of framework changes have taken place, and I've been involved to some degree in those as chair of the Conservative Environment Network for 10 years. Movement that I set up in 2011 to battle hard within the conservative movement to lift environmental, climate, nature issues up the agenda and to get stuff done. We now have about half of the current crop of Conservative MPs in our caucus. We have a whole bunch of peers. We've got hundreds of councillors up and down the country, and I think we've made a real difference. And sometimes during some quite difficult times, UK is one of the only countries in the world where conservatives are broadly on message when it comes to the environment. If you go to Australia or the US, Canada, Brazil, inexplicably to me, those who consider themselves conservatives are terrible on these issues. So it's been a useful thing. And I spent 5 years from 2018 to 2022 on the board of DEFRA as a government advisor and non-executive, where I worked a lot on the Environment Act, which is a pretty comprehensive piece of legislation that was passed in 2021, with a whole range of legally binding targets that are going to ratchet tighter in the coming years, no matter who's in government, on everything from air quality to water quality to pesticide usage and so on, nature recovery targets. And I worked specifically on the Agriculture Act 2020, which reforms agricultural subsidies. I mean, I think it's the biggest win for nature that we've ever seen in this country, and it was the main topic of conversation, as I understand it, in your Windsor event. This idea that England is the first of the nations of the world to move from a system in which farmers are subsidized simply on the basis of how much land they're farming, which of course creates an incentive to farm every square inch, even the wet bits and the steep bits and the bits that are no good for farming, to a new system called environmental land management, which directly rewards farmers and other land managers for the stewardship and restoration of soil, watercourses, natural capital on which everything depends, and nature more broadly. So I think that those frameworks in which I played a small part developing, I think are they're directly relevant to your event and the work that Ethos is doing, and I think that they are creating a change that is becoming inexorable towards the restoring of nature in what is one of the most nature depleted countries on the planet. I grew up with a real love of nature. I mean, like most children, I was obsessed with finding birds' nests and peering at their eggs and building ponds in the back garden and transferring tadpoles from the park pond to our own. And that was just my life, putting up bird boxes and watching David Attenborough shows. And it didn't take me very long to come to the understanding that I live in a country that is terribly nature depleted. The bottom 5%, it turns out, in the world. We rank alongside Ireland and Iceland and Malta and Kuwait as the most nature depleted countries on earth. I have always longed to put that right, to be part of a movement to restore nature. I wrote a letter age 14 to the Country Life magazine, which is Britain's biggest rural affairs magazine, saying that their readership lack imagination on the subject of restoring wild boar to Britain. And I got the star
Fantastic.
letter. I got a prize, some binoculars or something. So I've always cared deeply about nature and about rewilding, restoration, like you both do. And I knew I wanted to devote a chunk of my life to this, which I've done in various ways, including this government advisory role. Um, and I guess I think the reason why you've got me on is because of a book that I've just brought out, which is entitled "God is an Octopus." We suffered in my family the cataclysm of an accident which killed my oldest daughter in July 2019, Iris, who was 15 and a half, and a real bright little spark, really a brilliant girl with a deep love of nature and a strong charisma and a very sharp mind and everything going for her. And so I kind of was thrown into the kind of darkness that we think we'll never survive. The one thing that parents believe that they will never survive is the loss of a child. But I have other children. I have a young wife. I have a family that needs me, and I had to find a way to survive this. I knew that from the beginning. And what I found quite early on is that the light that penetrated that darkness always came in the form of time spent in nature, or time spent thinking about how to restore nature. That accident and those terrible months coincided with the return of beavers to my part of Somerset. And I found myself traipsing the watercourses with my sons, looking for signs of beavers and feeling okay for a time. I found myself swimming in the pond. It was summer when the accident happened, 10 times a day, because being in that water somehow gave me some relief from the terrible pain and the darkness of that loss. And so I realized that my love of nature, from which I'd benefited all my life, wasn't just a hobby like stamp collecting, or model railways. This was something far deeper, a kind of calling that I believe that we all intrinsically have within us. The writer E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia to describe the innate love that all humans have for the non-human world. And I found in the darkest time of my life that that's real, and it's a thing that is very powerful. I felt carried and supported, and I realized that the purpose of my life, above and beyond my activities as a kind of financial investor, I have another life as an investor running a fund, and we invest people's money in a way that is green and aligned with the Paris process. And it's a nice thing to do, and I enjoy working with my colleagues. But I realized that the purpose of my life is nature, restoring this extraordinary, magical fabric of the world that exists all around us and that calls to us and that carries us when we most need it. So I guess it's the writing of that book and the work that I do as a rewilding advocate and so on that is the reason why you want me on your podcast, and I'm very grateful to be asked.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much to talk about. The critical acclaim for the book is pretty legendary. It's your first book, but not going to be your last book, because I think you're working on number 2. But the Value Exchange podcast is all about the search for meaning, if you like, between people and planet. And value exchange is a theory of change, if you like, in that if you strip it down, that search for meaning always, we've done it thousands of times over the years internally with the ventures that we've been building. It's always down to people, whether they're friends or family and planet, and that interplay between people and planet. And your book is a very eloquent journey, personal journey, very raw, of that you found nature in early life, and you're wondering post that horrific tragedy, how could anyone recover from that? But tell us a little bit more about the book, the story that you tell, for without spoiler alert, but tell us a little bit more about the book.
Yeah, I think I mean, you began your question with this idea of purpose and meaning, and I think that I think that that is an idea that has kind of become incredibly resonant in my life since the loss of Iris. This thought, what's the, why are we here? What are we supposed to do with this life that we've been given? That's been a place in which I've found a way to continue living, and in a way, it's a place in which I found a greater joy than I knew previously. A greater respect for life, a greater sense of gratitude. I mean, when something awful happens to you like this, and you lose someone you love, a lot of letters come in the post from family and friends and so on, and quite often they enclose books. And the author that was sent to me with the greatest frequency was Viktor Frankl, who survived unimaginable horrors in the Holocaust, and who then became a very, very important psychiatrist later. And his idea was that within all people is a kind of calling to meaning, a kind of will to meaning. So what he said was is that the route to finding happiness, to solving people's individual emotional mental tribulations, is to help them find their purpose. And I think that that is an idea that we come across over and over again in the environmental movement. People are happy, even though the environment is under assault, and that in many areas the omens are looking really frightening. You find people working on these issues who are fundamentally happy and motivated and purposeful, and that's because they're following this will to meaning. I describe in my book a guy called David Waters, who's devoted the last 30 years of his life to restoring great bustards to Salisbury Plain. That is Britain's heaviest flying bird. It's been extinct in Britain for several centuries, and this guy has devoted everything he has to bringing that bird back. And the energy and the joy just shine out of David Waters' eyes, in spite of extraordinary hardship in getting this done. I mean, he used to spend weeks collecting eggs and living in a tent in the kind of steppes of Western Russia, and he's really suffered and spent every penny he has getting this done. So I think that this is very resonant for me in the wake of our tragedy, is that it's fundamentally important to find the thing that you love and to devote yourself to doing it as your kind of chosen purpose in life. And I think that is one of the most important pathways to finding a sense of peace and happiness. In my book, I've described the realization that my love of nature in the early part of my life was much more than just an interest. It's a calling and a yearning, and as it turns out, nature, in its broadest sense, turned out to be a deeply important source of solace and meaning, and ultimately joy during the darkest time of my life. So that's really the story of my book. It's a year of searching for some ongoing trace of Iris, and a search for meaning and purpose in the thing that I love most, in nature, during that first year. And I didn't write it immediately. I wrote it 3 years down the line. I thought that laying out my stream of consciousness during that year might be a useful and important thing to do. And it came out relatively easily onto paper, and as it turns out, has attracted the attention of Bloomsbury and has been published. And now I'm living quite a strange life in the world of literature, which is a temporary thing, but it's quite an honor, and quite. I spoke at Hay, and it's a strange thing.
Yeah, and the book is a very raw stream of consciousness. It comes across as a fantastic narrative. But I think that if someone is watching this podcast going, "Oh, it's okay for Ben to do that. He's rich and privileged, and he could spend a lot of time, thinking and reflecting and reading Viktor Frankl and many, many books." But actually, Ben's story, I believe, is deeper than that, in that it's a story that all of us have got in us, whatever our age or our background, our socio-economic positions, in that it is very easy to just walk through life and just take a moment, to reflect not just on nature and the planet, but the other people in your life and those relationships that um, uh, have meaning and that matter. And I think that the Value Exchange podcast is trying to weave a bit of a web between people and planet. It's not a planet without people. There's a lot of people on the planet. And a lot of your book reflects, as you go through that journey, on the role of people. So, of course, Iris, but you are flooded with rich, wonderful relationships. I wonder if you just talk a little bit about the book and your journey and the context of other people in that exploration of meaning and identity and purpose.
So I'd say that suffering is not unique to any people of any description anywhere. It's something that is ubiquitous. And I think what we find in those parts of the world that are much less privileged than we are in this country, we find a much greater richness in spirituality and in family and in community. Those who are the poorest in the world, against whom we are extraordinarily rich and privileged in this country. We find the extraordinary Eastern traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. You find this very powerful tapestry of rites and practices and wisdom which help people endure unimaginable suffering. So I don't think the idea of spiritual searching in the aftermath of suffering is something that is unique to particular people. I think that is something that everyone does to some degree or other after something of this kind. You live your life in the illusion that these things will never happen to you, and then suddenly they do, and you are shocked into wondering what the hell happened, where did they go, what are we part of, what is death, is there some ongoing existence after death, is there God, is there some ordained purpose to our life. I think these kinds of existential questions and these kind of this kind of searching is something that anyone anywhere will go through. And I'd say that we are less fortunate in the rich world in having some kind of spiritual tradition on which to fall back. I think that if you live in Sri Lanka, or you live in parts of the East, or you live in any of the indigenous societies, I think that there are very well trodden paths that you can then walk down with guidance all around you. And those societies also happen to continue to have the important building structures around people, the family and community and so on, which are so vital in times of darkness. And in terms of connection with planet, well, of course, it's no coincidence that 80% of the world's intact ecosystems are in the stewardship of some of the most marginalized communities on the world, and that's the indigenous communities. And that's because they maintain this extraordinary connection with themselves, with the people around them, and with the planet around them. And that's something that I think that has become significantly depleted in the rich world. And I think in terms of connection with nature, I think that's where the main iniquity lies, in the sense that in our country, if you are rural and if you are privileged, you can probably walk out the back door and find yourself with some kind of access to nature. But if you're living on the 44th floor of a building in Tower Hamlets, access to nature is not available to you in the same way. And I think that this is something that is stark and pressing, and I think that it should be an overriding priority of local and central government to improve the accessibility of nature to all the people that live in this country. And this is a conversation I had with the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, at the Glasgow Climate Conference in November 2021. That we should have some kind of a task force that would weave wild, vibrant nature back through the fabric of our city and make it accessible to those people who currently don't really have access to nature, as was so terribly demonstrated during this lockdown period. Those of us that live in the country were able to access nature very easily, but many people in the middle of the city just had no ability to do that whatsoever. And we know that nature is vitally important, not just to our physical well-being, but to our mental and our spiritual well-being. We know that when we walk in the woods, the trees release volatile organic compounds which have the direct effect of making us feel better and feel happier. They lower our blood pressure, they lower our heart rate. And we don't know why the trees talk to us in this way. We don't understand what it's about. That the trees have this effect on us, but we know that it's real now, to the extent that health services in Japan and other places are prescribing forest bathing. And people who are sick are able to get a chit and get time off work and get funding to go into the forest a certain amount each day and spend time in nature for its therapeutic benefits. We know that the trees are talking to themselves through a huge wood wide web of mycelium fungal connections beneath the soil, and not just sharing information with each other, but sharing nutrients and supporting each other. We have no idea what that's about. The very idea of it would have been laughed out of the room a decade ago. The mystery is far grander and far more complex than we're even close to understanding. But what we know is that spending time in nature is intrinsically vital to our well-being. And so I think that if we're going to talk about iniquity, I think this is the principal manifestation of it, is people's access to nature. So Sadiq and I set up the Rewilding London Task Force, which has just reported its findings and its recommendations. And we got a brilliant group of people together, and £3 million has already been allocated to rewilding efforts, large and small, throughout the city. And if you walk in the parks, you'll find pocket rewilding taking place, patches of scrub, new reed beds, the interesting things happening along the railway lines and the canal sides, and terraced house gardens, flat rooftops, and some large rewilding projects happening on council-owned land in Enfield and Hainault and Dagenham and Croydon. So there's really interesting things happening now about bringing nature back into the city and reconnecting people with that nature. And we want it to be top down, in other words, supported by City Hall, but also bottom up, right down to someone putting wildflowers in their window box and attracting native pollinators in the springtime. And we want a whole kind of movement to reconnect urban people with nature. So I think that was the sense of, I think during my difficulties, the sense of privilege that I felt most acutely is in my ability to access nature, which is something in this country reserved for the rural and the rich. And I also felt a sense of privilege in having a wide family around me, and that's a privilege enjoyed very much in the developing world still, and much less so in the rich world. But I still have it. I was surrounded by nieces and nephews and cousins and aunts and uncles and children and so on, and that was incredibly important to me during that time.
Well, I want to treasure that cut there, Ben, because you were on a roll, and we always seem to get people on a roll, which is beautiful, and it's we shouldn't apologise for feeling great about this and to having moments where we can take the dark and actually shine and be our best selves. And there is a dot to join. One of the previous podcasts was a guy called Professor Atul Shah, who's just released a brilliant book. It's about the role of faith in finance and accounting, and the idea that there's a lot in God is an Octopus about exploring faith and spirituality and Ben's journey. And of course, access to nature is a huge privilege and part of the people and planet agenda, but also the rich relationships of nature and the sort of web that one can weave between meaning and spirituality and nature and people. And you've talked at the end of that last piece about the role of people in all of that, and I'd just like to just go away from nature a tiny bit and talk about people and the relationships and how that really is part of the mycelium, if you like, of Ben's life. That is these wonderful exchanges between your people ecosystem and how that we all must in searching for nature, we've also got to search for these people relationships as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's something that progress has cost us in the developed world. and that is the disintegration of the social support structures that were previously so important and which remain important, and their loss, I think, is felt in a whole range of individual and collective tribulations. Loneliness in old age and anxiety in youth, and all these things, I think, are a manifestation of our loss of connection with people and our loss of connection with planet. And I think we need to find a way to have material prosperity whilst rebuilding these intangible, priceless things that we've lost. My family's always been a big and tight knit family, and we do divorce very well. My ex-wife is my, is my sort of closest friend, and and I am, and there is a sense of community in my family for whatever reason. It might be the kind of matriarchal role that's fulfilled by my mother, who finds family extremely important and always has. But I think societally, and the left and the right have been just as guilty of this. Margaret Thatcher famously said that there's no such thing as society, only individuals, and was very open to moving people around.
Thanks for that.
Well, exactly. But then also, it's a problem across the spectrum in the developing nations. You look at the Soviet Union, made an absolute direct and focused effort similarly to shatter family structures and to replace that dependence with a dependence on the state. Children were encouraged to report on their parents and vice versa. So whether it's corporatist, capitalist centralized power or socialist command and control government centralized power, one of the primary objectives is to disintegrate decentralized structures of support, which are family and community. Because if you're able to survive and get by and thrive within the nest of your extended family and your community, then you need corporations and the state much less. So I think that wherever we are on the political spectrum, those centralized power structures have been problematic for these intangible support structures. But that's not to say they haven't been entirely beneficial in other ways. We live much happier, much more materially prosperous lives and much more convenient lives. And I think that our standard of living has been raised, immeasurably. But can we not find a way to have both? Can we not find a system that nurtures those things which are of intangible but vital value? Nature, family structures, community structures, whilst at the same time maintaining a kind of materially high standard of living. And I think that some countries of the developing world maybe have a better chance of doing that than we do. Look at Sri Lanka, for example. It's not without its very difficult issues, but compare it with Ireland. Sri Lanka is the same size as Ireland. They've got 4 times the number of people, and yet they still have a deep and rich spiritual tradition or traditions. Of course, there are Muslims, Hindus, Christians, and Buddhists living in Sri Lanka. And for somehow out of those spiritual traditions comes a deep respect for the natural world, such that the island still has 40 or 50% forest cover. They have this extraordinary national park network. They have 6,000 elephants, 1,000 leopards. It can't be easy to live on an island like Sri Lanka alongside that kind of wildlife, but they manage it. And if you go to Sri Lanka, you find these family support structures, you find vibrant communities, and and all these things that we've lost, they're still there. And yet the standard of living is rising. Women are not having 9 children now; they're having 2 or fewer, and they're having women in the workforce. Huge expansion of that, expansion of literacy, expansion of air conditioning, expansion of healthcare. So can Sri Lanka or some of these other countries show us how you can have both? I feel optimistic they can. I think their spiritual tradition will ensure that they do.
Yeah, and I think that I'd like to hand over to Annabelle for some questions because I'm dominating it. But I need to lie down probably and cut this bit out because you've said so much, Ben, in all of that. But whether you're from a council estate and you're unemployed, or you live in Sri Lanka or central London, it's not actually difficult to reflect to see the importance of the people and planet side of it. And if you just give people the opportunity to talk about that, and we need to talk more about it, then we can enact positive change. And you've talked about bottom up and top down change, and we're probably promoting more of the bottom up stuff, not in the context of uprising, but bottom up meets top down. So, and Annabelle, you airtime for your questions.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, and I'm really conscious of the time as well because we're nearly out. But I was drawn back to your comment earlier, Ben, about your letter to Country Life, and calling out everybody for having no imagination. And I feel a frustration that I feel all the time is that we need to find the balance you just described there between actually what do we need to do, what is essential, what change do we, how are we going to stop this killing everything, societal decline and the planet dying, but without it nothing is extreme, now this side is not right and that side's not right. It is going to be collaboration and moderation of one's self-interest in the middle of it all that creates something better. And I'm interested in the Sri Lanka story because I feel we have to go through a little bit of a sensible but considered deconstruction of some of the things that exist now, because we've created them, and actually I can't see a trajectory where they can be as they are because it doesn't make any sense. And I seek a lot more innovation, imagination. At the weekend, I was talking to somebody about, maybe the future is that we all, look after each other. That becomes our, the most important thing that we do. We look after each other, we look after the planet. It's not about material gain. It's about how can I help my neighbours? How can I help? And actually, if we could transition, and it's not a short-term job, but transition to a state of, where what matters is looking after each other, I think we'd be on a much better trajectory. But that's quite a an out there thought. It means the complexity of that is massive, but the commonsensical and no rocket science, surely that makes sense. I just wondered how you sit, where you are on what we can do, what we can do and what should we be doing.
I mean, I feel that things are changing very fast, in the sense that it strikes me that there's a kind of great upwelling in this country, but everywhere, of love for the natural world and of yearning for a closer connection with, as you've both put it, people and planet. I don't know whether it was the lockdowns that triggered some kind of change or whether this was on its way anyway, but there's a vast expansion in the number of people that want to immerse themselves in nature, including very literally with wild swimming. The trends on wild swimming are extraordinary. 1,000% increase in 10 years of the number of people who regularly swim in wild watercourses in England. So I think that there is a growing clamor for meaningful action to restore the natural fabric of our country and beyond. Look at the nature restoration bill that's going through the European Parliament at the moment. The US, you've had the Inflation Reduction Act that had some extraordinary provisions for nature and the environment, but also the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, individual state stuff. Like last night I was reading about Florida's Wildlife Corridors Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation to restore wildlife corridors throughout that state, the Everglades and so on. It figures in my mind that this is becoming a meaningful issue for people in the way that they vote, the way that they spend their money. And it doesn't seem, according to polling, to matter whether it's young or old people, people who lean left or lean right, people who are urban or rural. It seems to be that these issues are finding their way to the top of the agenda and staying there. And in parallel with that, I think that there is a kind of spiritual searching that's taking place in a way that we might not have imagined 10 years ago. Look, for example, at the use of psychedelic therapies to help people who are suffering post-traumatic stress or anxiety, depression, bereavement, people with terminal diagnoses who are in fear of death. These are becoming mainstream now in their use in the United States, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, Portugal. that they're showing extraordinary clinical results. And of course, these are techniques that are derived from, the central spiritual practices of the world's indigenous people. If you go to the Amazon basin or the Sami people of the northern hemisphere, the North Pole, or the Pueblo Indians, or these people all, and through time, have used psychedelic experience as a way to overcome individual and collective challenges, and as a kind of central spiritual sacrament. Well, these are becoming mainstream in our own society now, and I think that they do offer just that, a pathway to greater connection with oneself, to greater connection with others, and to greater connection with the planet. And I've only had one psychedelic experience in my life, but it was at a very important time in my life, a year after losing Iris. And it remains the most beautiful and meaningful experience of my life. And it frames everything that I do and everything that I think today. And I'm so grateful that I had that opportunity during that dark time, because it was hugely enlightening. And the output for me can be summed up as you have, which is connection with people and planet. So I think that there's something stirring, and I just wonder whether it's going to be too late, because clearly it's 11th hour in terms of environmental breakdown, and climate science becomes increasingly terrifying with every passing week. Nature does appear to be blinking out all around us. So are we going to see that shift take place in a broad and deep enough way to pull us out of this crisis and rebuild what matters in our society? And I'm sort of optimistic that we will, but maybe you'd call that faith. I didn't really have much in the way of faith, as most people would understand the word, prior to losing Iris. And now I do have faith. I'm not religious. I'm Christian and confirmed, because it gave me a week off school, at the time. But and partly because of my psychedelic experience, I believe that there is God, and I believe that there is some great benevolence, and maybe even some great plan of some kind. I think it's all stranger than we're capable of understanding, but I do have some faith that we'll work it out. But I think the discussion we've had on this podcast is how we're going to work it out. Terence McKenna, the philosopher, famously said that the world's remaining indigenous people are our best last hope, and I think he may be right.
I'm almost speechless, Ben, which is quite rare for me, as Annabelle will tell you. I mean, I'm going to treasure this podcast forever and listen to it again and again when I'm having a hard day, which is quite frequent. What a beautiful interview. Thank you. Back to Annabelle.
Thank you so much for your time today, Ben.
And the book, God is an Octopus, and this isn't a public endorsement of psychedelic experiences, and I won't do a spoiler alert, but if you want to find out more about Ben's search for meaning and psychedelic experiences, then you got to buy the book and read the book. So Ben, thank you so much for this. It was a privilege, really, I mean that, to be able to spend a bit of time with you and put this down for my and everybody else's posterity.
Thank you both so much for having me on. I feel very grateful and very privileged to have been with you both. And I think Ethos is awesome. And I think you're playing a really important part. So I look forward to catching up with you offline. But thank you both. And I will duck out.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.